Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are tuned in to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, September the 4th, 2024. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. I really do appreciate you tuning in. September the 4th. It's September. Well, that's obvious. Um, where is the summer gone? It just flew right by. August this year in Ottawa was not a particularly hot month. We had a handful of hot days, and we strung together a couple of 3 or 4 or 5 days of extremely warm weather. But for the most part, it was normal and better than normal, depending on your point of view, I suppose. We actually had some quite cool days in August where we actually barely reached 20 degrees Celsius, which is just around the 70-degree mark Fahrenheit. Uh, why do I say this? I don't know, because I keep on wondering about this global warming stuff and what have you, and the fact that, the real experiences of people doesn't really match the alarmist stuff that's out there. So anyway, I don't want to spend any time, actually. I don't want, it's not just that I don't want to spend much time. I don't want to spend any time on global warming or anything like that this week. I want to talk about the International Criminal Court and the fact that Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, recently, just this week, traveled to Mongolia. Mongolia is a signatory to the Rome Treaty, which founded the International Criminal Court. But notwithstanding that, the Mongolian government refused to arrest Vladimir Putin, despite the fact that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for him. So I want to talk a little bit about that and the International Criminal Court and why the Mongolian government actually deserves a pat on the back. And don't take me out of context before you jump to conclusions and say that Ben-Ami, he's a pro-Putin or whatever, or pro-dictator. No, I'm not. But I think it's important to understand that there are other points of view with respect to the International Criminal Court and how it conducts its business, and how, in fact, it undermines peaceful relations and cordial, effective relationships between sovereign states. So we're going to get into that later on in the show. But first, I have to spend some time talking about the situation in the Middle East with respect particularly to Gaza and Israel and the ongoing negotiations between those two entities, with Qatar, Egypt, and the United States playing a role in trying to broker some sort of a ceasefire and hostage versus prisoner exchange. And the reason I really need to go into this is because I follow the news like everybody else does, and I say right from the start, okay, let's not beat around the bush. I'm partisan. I have friends and family who live in Israel who are deeply affected by what's been going on there, and of course, being in the Jewish community here in North America, we're not immune to all of the shenanigans that are going on. On a regular basis, we get bomb threats. We have to hire separate security. Just yesterday, we had a Labor Day picnic at our synagogue, quiet suburban Ottawa, national capital of Canada, where I'm broadcasting from. But we still have to pay for private security to watch out for any kind of untoward behavior directed at our synagogue and its members, when all they're doing is having some hamburgers and hot dogs and corn on the cob, like so many other people do in North America on Labor Day. But nevertheless, we have to hire security. So it's not just in the Middle East, it's everywhere. Anti-Semitism has become a much bigger problem, certainly overtly, than it was a year ago at this time, let's say. But that's North America. Let's just focus on the situation in the Middle East, because again, as I say, if you're following the news, you're getting a very, not just a wrong impression about what's going on, but more importantly, there are certain things that the media is reporting accurately on that I don't really think people appreciate the seriousness of what is happening and what we're seeing. And I'm referring here specifically to the negotiations, so-called negotiations, for the release of hostages, the ceasefire negotiations. And of course, everybody's calling for a ceasefire. And, I'm thinking to myself, I must be living in some sort of a parallel universe, because it's astonishing to me that some of the actions, the positions that are being taken by the international community vis-a-vis Israel and the Hamas terrorists, or the Hamas irregular army, whatever you want to call them, against whom the Israeli government is currently at war. The positions that are taken by the international community, and in fact the positions that are taken by some of the participants to the negotiations, the so-called honest brokers, again, it's just astonishing to me that people don't realize, they don't see the problem with how these people, these entities, not Hamas, not Israel, but the entities in the international community that are trying to impose some sort of a settlement, the damage that they're doing, not just to Israel, but to the Palestinians themselves. I've often said the problem with the peace process in the Middle East is the peace process. Left to their own devices, the people who live there, whatever side of the conflict, and there are many conflicts in the Middle East to have a side on, but whatever conflict you're involved with, and whatever side you're on, if the international community would just butt out and stop with the trying to encourage agreements and formal negotiations and written contracts and treaties, etc., if they just butt out, I think that you would see, at a minimum, a modus vivendi emerge between all of the parties in the Middle East. They might not have formal peace agreements, but they learn to live together. And ultimately, let's take Canada and the United States for an example. Canada and the United States don't have a peace agreement, but we live amicably next to one another. We used to call it the longest undefended border in the world between Canada and the United States. We don't have to have a treaty. We live together side by side. And that's the way it's been. And it hasn't been planned that way. That's what's emerged over a period of time. Now, granted, we don't have the same history of animosity towards one another, although Canada being, loyal to the crown, well, the United States did fight a few wars against, 2 wars against the British Empire, both the American Revolution and the War of 1812. So we in Canada, or Canadians, even though Canada was not a dominion or sovereign country at the time, okay, there was some animosity that developed at that time. Fine. But it's not the same thing. Be that as it may, it's an example of how you don't actually have to sit down and negotiate an agreement not to make war with one another, not to shoot at one another. These things are not necessary. And they're not really necessary in the Middle East either. The reason that it becomes so difficult or problematic, and we're going to get to the Gaza situation and the hostages and those negotiations in a moment, but the reason why you see these periodic flare-ups of violence, apart from the fact that the entities like Hamas want to stir up the pot, if you will, in order to have a reaction by the international community. So they're going to act independently. But remember, if the international community didn't pay so much attention to the Middle East and didn't have such a fixation on the idea, almost a fetish on the idea of promoting formal peace negotiations and a formal peace treaty between the conflicting entities, between the belligerents, then perhaps entities like Hamas wouldn't feel that there's any kind of benefit to fomenting unrest and fomenting dissatisfaction in the international community with Israel, as Hamas did on October the 7th of last year, knowing that Israel would go to war, knowing that civilians would die. That's part of their strategy. I know it's hard to believe, but it is. It's part of their strategy, ladies and gentlemen. And so, I guess what I'm saying here is, if you leave people to find their own way, they will. If you leave people to live in peace, they'll find a way to coexist with one another. And maybe 50 years from now, maybe 100 years from now, if it's necessary to codify that modus vivendi, that emerging status quo of non-belligerence into some sort of a treaty, well, okay, it's possible that it'll happen. But right now, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because the belligerent parties, and in this respect, I do include Israel, are not in a position where there is sufficient support in those individual regions, entities, countries, for the most part, for formal peace treaties. Now, I'm saying I count Israel in that as well, and I do. Israel is much more willing to sign a peace treaty than pretty much any of the other entities in the Middle East. But there are significant portions of Israeli society that, it's not that they're opposed to peace, but they can't bring themselves to actually putting pen to paper and saying, we're going to give up this, or we're going to sacrifice that, or anything like that. So that dynamic exists in Israel as well. There's no sense in pretending that it doesn't. It's to a lesser degree than other entities, but it does exist in Israel. But when you talk about, let's say, the Palestinians, there's no way that the Palestinian Authority is going to sign an agreement giving up its territorial demands in exchange for a peace agreement. There's just no way. Even if they're not fighting. If they're not fighting, that's, as I say, modus vivendi. Finding a way to live together. Not fighting with one another, not killing one another. That's something that people can accept. But to take that now and to say we're going to make a declaration in writing that we are giving up our demands, that's a bridge too far. And we tend to forget that in the West. We tend to forget how important reputation is in that part of the world. We forget how important that kind of stuff is. So the first thing I would say is that the international community needs to butt out. At least insofar as trying to push the belligerent parties into some sort of an agreement that neither of them are ready to enter into. And even if, take Israel for instance, even if Israel was to sign a treaty, an agreement of some sort, the Hamas and Iran in particular, and its proxies like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like the Houthis in Yemen, okay, like the terrorist organizations operating in Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank, they're not prepared. And they would sign an agreement if it meant gaining some sort of a territorial advantage, and then they would break the agreement, as they have done repeatedly. Let's not forget all of the people out there that are calling for a ceasefire. They're all forgetting that there was a ceasefire in place. And Hamas broke the ceasefire on October the 7th. That's an important fact for whatever it's worth. we're going to go for our first break. When we come back, we're going to pick up on this. I want to get into the actual negotiations and how the international community is actually undermining things, making things worse, in fact, prolonging the conflict and the suffering of the Palestinian people who may not be pro-Hamas. We'll get into that on the other side of the break. So stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And we are back. Thank you so much for staying with us. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for, what's the date today? September the 4th, 2024. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. There's my chair squeaking. Oh, man. A lot of background noise. I don't know if actually the microphone even picked that up. I suppose I should be a little bit more discreet in that respect. Okay, we have been talking about the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, and we've been talking about some of the background and how my view is that, in fact, it's the international community's obsession with promoting peace in the Middle East that is probably the number one reason why we don't have any kind of a formal peace agreement, and we have these constant, almost on schedule flare-ups of violence. So let's just move beyond that a little bit, and let's focus right now on the situation with hostages in Israel, in Gaza, Israeli hostages predominantly, not only, and certainly not only Jewish hostages, okay? Something that's really, I think, critical to bear in mind, and that is that some of those hostages are, in fact, not Israeli citizens at all, and some of them are Christian, some of them are Muslim, and many of the soldiers who are presently fighting in Gaza, defending Israel, are actually Muslim Arabs who are citizens of Israel. And if you're a Muslim Arab as a citizen of Israel, you're not drafted into the defense forces. You have to volunteer. So every Muslim, unless you're Druze is a sect of Islam, and when Israel was founded, they leaders of the Druze community came to the leaders of the new government, and they said, we want to be part of the citizens, full citizens, which means not just that we get all of the benefits, but we also have to shoulder all of the obligations. And so if you're a member of the Druze community, which is a Muslim sect in Israel, you're an Israeli citizen, and you are subject to the draft. So you have to serve in the Israeli army, or, could be the Navy or the Air Force as well. But you have to serve in the defense forces in some capacity. Unlike other Arabs, the other Arab, Muslim, Israeli citizens do not have to serve in the army. And that's important to understand because every single Arab Muslim who is an Israeli citizen who is serving in the IDF, and there are a significant number of them, are volunteers. They're not forced. There's no conscription. So that's an important point to remember. So let's talk about these hostages, and let's talk in particular about the negotiations around a ceasefire and the call for a ceasefire. Bearing in mind that there already was a ceasefire, the ceasefire existed prior to October the 7th of last year. And Hamas broke the ceasefire agreement when it attacked Israel on that day. But what about the negotiations for a ceasefire now, with the current fighting? And the negotiations part and parcel of that for the return of hostages that are being held? Well, the first thing is this. When you pressure Israel for a ceasefire, remember, Israel didn't kidnap anybody. They're not holding any hostages. They don't have cards to play in this respect. And so when you put Israel in the dock, when you put pressure on the state of Israel to make compromises in order to obtain a ceasefire, what you're basically doing is you are creating what in negotiation is called a power imbalance. You are empowering Hamas, who, by the way, are the ones with the cards. They're the ones who are saying, give us what we want or you're not going to get back what you want. This is a game that Israel isn't playing. They didn't start this game. This isn't a question of, well, give us back all of our hostages and we're going to agree to a ceasefire. Now, they may, under those conditions, agree to a ceasefire, but that's not what they're looking for. They would like all of the hostages back, obviously. But to include hostages in a ceasefire agreement like this, there's a certain perversity to that. But I don't know if anyone caught this. There were two items that came up in the last little while, the last few days. The first, of course, as we know, late last week, the Israeli forces recovered the bodies of 6 hostages who were executed when they were on the verge of being rescued. And it was a horrific event. It has been traumatizing for the people who are living in Israel, the Israeli citizens, which is hard to believe given the trauma that they've already experienced over the course of the past 12 months, let alone the last 12 centuries. Okay. But this was a very serious problem, a very serious occurrence. And it's really precipitated a great deal of soul searching within Israel. Are we doing enough in terms of negotiations? Should we be more flexible in negotiating a ceasefire in order to obtain the release of these hostages. And it's a legitimate question. I'm not going to express an opinion on it one way or the other. I do have strong feelings, but this is a question for Israelis, the government of Israel, and the people to whom they're accountable that they have to sort out for themselves. And there's turmoil, there's real soul searching going on over that question right now. But while that's going on, along comes President Biden, who is a sitting duck president. He's worse than a sitting duck president. A sitting duck president is somebody with all of his faculties in place, etc., command of the situation, etc., but who is not running again and therefore doesn't have to worry about being reelected. That's what a sitting duck president is. Okay? So, you can tell a sitting duck president, yeah, go jump in the lake, because they're not going to be able to do anything to you, because they're not going to be in power in a few months. So along comes Biden, and he's asked a straightforward question. Is Israel doing enough? Is Netanyahu in particular doing enough in order to bring these ceasefire negotiations to a successful conclusion? And he just gives a one-word answer: no. Walks away. No? The very fact that Israel is at the table is a big deal, given what they have been exposed to, given the fact that they are not the aggressors here. Why this obsession with a ceasefire? Because you want to save innocent Palestinian lives? Okay. But the best way to do that is to let the Israelis fight it out to the bitter end. This whole conflict could change overnight. It could end tomorrow if Hamas simply surrendered. But they're not going to surrender. They're not going to surrender because the international community keeps on throwing them a lifeline. Why continue to say to Hamas, we want you to negotiate a ceasefire? You can draw out negotiations for years. Do you know it took years and years for the Americans and the North Vietnamese to work out an agreement for the withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam? And then 2 years later, the North Vietnamese invaded South Vietnam, and that was the end of that country. So when you insist on negotiations to start off with, you are empowering Hamas and encouraging them to play the cards that they have so atrociously and obscenely stolen, and that is to say the lives of those innocent hostages. You're basically saying that's a legitimate thing for you to do. And that just draws the conflict out. But then to say that Netanyahu's not doing enough, that just adds more negotiating power to Hamas and lessens it destroys whatever balance exists in the power structure of the negotiations. And to have a broker say that about its own allies, I have to say it's almost unprecedented. Think if in World War II, if the Americans, before they entered into the war, before they themselves were attacked, before Germany declared war on the Americans, if the Americans had said, you British, we think you should have a ceasefire with Germany, and when the Germans are playing them and drawing it out and not being honest and not being credible, and good faith negotiators, rather than saying, okay, you Germans are screwing around, so we're not going to push, or we're not, interested in encouraging Britain to stop bombing your cities, for instance. But that's not what's happened here. What's happened here in the Middle East is the Americans are saying, as if they would have said to the British, you know what, those Germans are bad, we understand, but, I think we should have a ceasefire. And if we are not going to agree to a ceasefire and do more for a ceasefire with these people who are already proven to be bad faith negotiators, well, we're just going to have to reduce arms, the kind of support that we're giving you in our Lend-Lease program. There are no words to adequately describe the insanity of that position. We're going overtime a little bit. Let's go for our next break. We'll pick up on this a little bit on the other side of the break. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Please don't go away. Lots more to talk about. And we are back. You're tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for September the 4th, 2024. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for sticking with us. Okay, so again, we're talking about the situation in the Middle East. We're talking about Hamas, negotiations around hostages, ceasefire negotiations, etc., etc. And I've talked a little bit about how the actions and the statements of members of the international community who are inserting themselves into the negotiations, trying to broker a deal, have been publicly criticizing Israel for not doing enough to bring about a deal. And as the saying goes, with friends and allies like this, who needs enemies? Because what ends up happening is you create a power imbalance in the negotiations, and that actually undermines the whole negotiation process. So when Joe Biden talks about how the government of Israel, particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, is allegedly not doing enough to bring about a successful conclusion of these negotiations for a ceasefire. All that's happened is he has created more power for Hamas, thereby discouraging Hamas to negotiate in good faith. They are encouraged, because what they want to do is they want Israel to be criticized in the international community. They want to delegitimize Israel. They want to delegitimize the government of Israel. So it plays perfectly into their hands. And I'm flabbergasted that the President of the United States, I mean, you could criticize the President of the United States all you want, and I do in this regard for sure, but he has a team around him as well that are advising him. And I can't help but think that members of his team are taking the same position that he just expressed publicly the other day coming out of church, when he said that in answer to the question, is Netanyahu doing enough, do you think, to encourage the successful conclusion of these negotiations, or words to that effect, his answer was a blunt no. Okay, I mean, now, here's the thing. To make matters worse, ladies and gentlemen, as if they can't get worse, but to make matters worse, the United States just announced, yesterday I believe it was, that it was seeking the arrest. It was charging leaders of Hamas, including Sinwar, with whatever crimes are associated with their attack on Israel against, in some cases, American citizens. So I'm assuming, kidnapping, assault, murder. So the United States has basically said to the individuals with whom they are trying to broker a ceasefire agreement between them, these individuals who are now indicted in the United States, and Israel. Basically what they've said is, we're going to arrest you guys, put you on trial, and you're going to spend the rest of your lives in jail in the super max security penitentiary that we have, or prosecutors may seek the death penalty. I don't know. I don't know what the specific penalties are for the specific crimes that have been alleged. But what I do know is that a day after the President of the United States says that Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, is not doing enough to bring these ceasefire negotiations to a successful conclusion. And we have leaks coming out of the negotiations, my guess is from American sources, but they're unidentified, who are also saying that Netanyahu's peace conference, where he doubled down on his conditions for withdrawing, Israel's conditions for withdrawing its forces from Gaza, that press conference and the speech that Netanyahu gave before it basically blew up the negotiations. Blew up, that was the term that was used. It blew up the negotiations. That's what we're hearing from these unidentified sources. And I'm going, but your own government, that is to say the government of the United States, has charged members of the other side in this negotiation with crimes, and presumably they're going to take every step that they can to arrest these people and bring them to justice in American courts. And there's no way that they're going to get acquitted of whatever the crimes are. If that, ladies and gentlemen, if I seem speechless, it's because I'm borderline speechless. I cannot fathom how anyone who is attached to these negotiations could say that because Netanyahu has doubled down, okay, reiterated Israel's demands, its position, which is what he's supposed to do. He's the prime minister of Israel. And these are the conditions, the demands. And maybe the Israeli government will back off if they actually get something tangible from the other side of the negotiations. Negotiations are not just one side. Okay, there's supposed to be some give and take. What is the give and take? Because the Hamas negotiators have not shown, in my judgment, any good faith here. But even if the accusation is true, that the negotiations now have been blown up because Netanyahu reiterated in public what he believes are Israel's minimum demands. Just because he did that blew up the negotiations? I don't buy it. But far worse than that, ladies and gentlemen, is the American government, who are brokering these negotiations. The American government, the broker, the mediator, if you will, announces that they're going to arrest members of the other negotiating team. Am I really the only person that has observed this and said, well, this is classically blowing up, ladies and gentlemen, blowing up the negotiations? Again, the best thing to have happened here would have been for the international community that originally, quite rightly, was very supportive of Israel and very condemnatory towards Hamas, with the possible exception of David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary of the UK at the time, who was right away talking about pressuring Israel to agree to a two-state solution, the old two-state solution dance. Okay? But other than that exception, the reality is that the international community was very supportive of Israel. And if they had just continued to support Israel and not interfered, then yes, it's true. Innocent people die in every war. It's collateral damage. I hate the term collateral damage because it sounds so, antiseptic. But that's what happens in war. That's what happens in war. And the way to minimize civilian casualties in war is to end the war. And the way you end the war is you fight it out to its conclusion. And if the international community had not taken measures to demand that Israel restrain itself and taken tangible measures to compel Israel to restrain its reaction, if the international community had basically said, Hamas did this and we're going to basically say, plague on your house, you brought it on yourself, we're done with you, and Israel is going to do whatever it has to do. If that had been the position of the international community and they had held to it consistently, this war would be over already. It'd be over already. They'd already be talking about a plan to rebuild Gaza. Hamas would be gone. The hostages, I don't know. I can't speak about the hostages. My guess is that a lot more of them would have been rescued, but maybe none of them would have been rescued. I can't speak to that. I have very strong feelings about it, but the hostages are secondary almost, I think, and I know how painful that is to accept, but the hostages in this case are almost secondary to the main issue of prosecuting this war against Hamas. So what's the bottom line here, ladies and gentlemen? If you're listening to this from Canada, the United States, whatever country you're listening to it from, you don't have to like Israel. You don't have to like Jews. You don't have to agree with what they're doing. But if you want to end the conflict, there are two ways for it to end and can end quickly. The first is you basically say Israel's going to do what it's going to do and we're not going to interfere, and that means Israel gets to fight it out to the bitter end, because sometimes when differences are irreconcilable, when conflicts are irreconcilable, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the solution. People who say fighting never solved anything are historically brain dead. Wars generally are the way these matters are settled. It's not nice, it's not pretty. Doesn't mean that I'm a warmonger. I'm just stating a historical fact. Sometimes you just have to fight it out. And if you don't want to fight it out, the answer is even simpler. Surrender. That was the answer in Germany. Unconditional surrender. The war lasted as long as it did because the German government refused to surrender. And all of the suffering and pain and destruction that the German people were subjected to, all of that was on the shoulders of the German government that started the war and then refused to surrender. And so the Allies were forced to fight it out to the bitter conclusion. That's the proper analogy. Running a little bit over time, let's take our final break, and when we come back, we'll talk very briefly about the visit of Vladimir Putin to Mongolia and the implications for the International Criminal Court. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Banami Show. Welcome back to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. I appreciate you sticking with us. In the short time that we have left, I want to discuss very briefly the visit of Russian President Vladimir Putin to the country of Mongolia and the implications that that visit has to the International Criminal Court. Now, Mongolia is a signatory to the treaty that established the International Criminal Court, the Rome Treaty, and as a consequence of that, because the International Criminal Court has issued warrants for the arrest of Vladimir Putin on the charge of having committed war crimes or encouraged the commitment of war crimes, that the government of Mongolia was obligated by treaty to execute those arrest warrants, that is to say, to take Vladimir Putin into custody. Yes, I know, you're probably smiling and going, okay, I don't know if that would work out so well ultimately for the Mongolian government, but let's just not worry about what the reaction of the Russian government to that kind of action might be. Of course, the Mongolian government refused to execute those warrants. And so everybody's up in a tizzy about it. But you know what? I actually think that the Mongolian government did the right thing. The International Criminal Court, by taking it upon itself to issue warrants for the arrest of leaders of countries, and this ties into this whole idea of somehow or other now the Americans expect that they're going to be taken seriously as honest brokers, as mediators in the negotiations for a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel after issuing arrest warrants for members of Hamas who are members of the negotiating team. Okay. And it's crazy. And what it does is it actually undermines the negotiations. And in the case of the international community, let's set aside Israel and the Middle East for a moment. Just generally speaking, when parties are in conflict with one another, when sovereign states are in conflict with one another, at some point in time, they have to come to agreements, not just to end the fighting, but to address whatever the points of dispute that led to the fighting were. And that's not possible in an environment where the leaders of these countries are under indictment by this supranational quasi-judicial body. Because if I was a Vladimir Putin, why would I make peace with Ukraine? What's the benefit to me as an individual in making peace with the Ukrainian government? At some point in time, the Ukrainian leaders and the Russian leaders have to come together and they have to negotiate. And at some point in time, presumably, let's say the United States government, with its shuttle diplomacy, succeeds in brokering an agreement between Ukraine. Actually, the American government is not a good example because the United States is not a signatory to the Rome Treaty, so they have no treaty obligation, I should say, to arrest Vladimir Putin. But let's say France or the UK. Let's say that these countries, for whatever reason, decide that they're going to try to broker a deal, and they're successful. And now you want the government, the leader of Russia and the leader of Ukraine to sit down at the same table and sign the agreement. Where would they possibly do this? They wouldn't be able to do it in the UK if the UK was saying, okay, now that you've made peace, now we're going to arrest you and put you on trial for war crimes. The reality, ladies and gentlemen, the reality is that bad things happen in the international community. Bad things happen in wartime. things that in normal circumstances might be prosecutable. And I'm not diminishing any of that. I'm not implying that there's any kind of impunity. There shouldn't be. But without that impunity, and as I say, there shouldn't be in a perfect world, I should add, but without that impunity, there is no incentive to truly negotiate these settlements. Because Vladimir Putin signing off on this is essentially signing off on, his own arrest warrant. He's basically giving a green light. He would be giving a green light in those circumstances to being arrested and prosecuted and being put in jail. Why would he do that? And why would the Russian people tolerate that? So the International Criminal Court, ladies and gentlemen, the processes that are in place, while I fully accept that the motive behind all of these agreements is pure. Of course, people don't want to see war crimes committed, and those people who commit war crimes, they want to see them held accountable. But sometimes you have to just say, we're not going to fight it out over the past. It's not pretty, but for the sake of peace, the bigger picture, we're going to say, okay, what we don't agree that what you did was right, but we're not willing to continue to prosecute not just a war, but other legal proceedings against you if the alternative is that we're going to have peace. That's what compromise is all about. And I know in this day and age where people look at things in black and white, I know they don't want to hear that. And some people are appalled when I make this kind of an explanation. But it's the reality, ladies and gentlemen. Why would Vladimir Putin make peace in the Ukraine when he's under indictment by the International Criminal Court? Why would he do this? There's no incentive. In fact, all of the incentive, it's a disincentive to making peace. So this is a serious situation, and this is why the International Criminal Court has such a malevolent, such a destructive effect, ultimately, on the prospects and the pursuit of peaceful settlements to some of these conflicts. The Rome Treaty, the International Criminal Court, has, I won't say it's been a disaster, but if it hasn't been a disaster, it's only because it hasn't meddled in serious conflicts yet. It's meddling now in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but it's not being helpful. If anything, its meddling is potentially prolonging the conflict. And for pity's sake, we're going to prosecute Benjamin Netanyahu, the leader of Israel? The UK government, the new UK government, has said that if Netanyahu visits Israel, they will arrest him. Is this the way you treat your allies? All right, ladies and gentlemen, coming to the end of our show for this week. Appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to check out the website, www.josephbenamy.com. All one word without the hyphen. While you're there, sign up for your free email updates. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, we will see you next week. God bless. Stay safe. And whatever you do, do not drink the Kool-Aid.